All right, fifth grade. So in our last lesson, we ended with the Boston Massacre, right? And that was the colonists taunting British troops firing, and then because the Committee of Correspondence had already been set up, word goes out Britain is hurting and fighting against the colonists. This was an example of an advertisement from a colonial paper, and it shows the coffins or sarcophaguses of those who were killed. Now it says five died, but at this point they only put four. But they have the bodies of Samuel Gray, Samuel Merrick, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, the unhappy victims who fell in the bloody Mayfair massacre on the Monday evening proceedings. On this occasion, most of the shops in town were shut. All the bells were ordered to toll a solemn peal, and were also those in the neighboring towns of Charleston, Roxbury. The procession began to move between the hours of 4 and 5 in the afternoon. Two of the unfortunate sufferers, James Caldwell and Crispus Attucks, were strangers born from. So this kind of talks about those people. But this was an example of an article put in the reading to show, you know, those that were killed, and they had a procession for those that were fallen. So what happens? In response to the Boston Massacre, Parliament repealed all the taxes on the colonists except the tax on tea. Now, although colonists loved their tea, many boycotted it because of the tax. Now, tea time. We've heard of that, right? It's tea time, and we have our tea and our biscuits and our crumpets, right? It was a central part to English life, and granted, most of the colonists were English or European. The tea was so important, right? So the fact that they weren't being taxed on this one item, everyone, doesn't matter how poor you were, you had tea. And so being taxed on it was a huge like stab to the heart. The largest British tea company, the British East India Company, lost a great deal of money. To save the company, Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773. It said that only this company could sell tea to the colonies. With this tax, the British hoped to force the colonists to buy British tea. The Tea Act did, in fact, lower the cost of tea, but the colonists were still angry because of the unfair law passed without their approval. They were also angry that they were forced to buy tea from only one company. What if Parliament decided to let certain companies control other imported items? Right? That's called a monopoly when only one company controls a certain domain or business. Again, the colonists protested. Some spoke out while others boycotted tea. In Boston, some local citizens acted against the tea. On December 16th, 1773, a group of men dressed as American natives boarded a ship in Boston Harbor. They opened 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the water. Today, this incident is known as the Boston Tea Party. Soon, people began to sing about it in the colonies. Rally, Mohawks, an American Indian tribe, they sang, bring out your axes and tell King George we'll pay no tea on this foreign tea. But in Great Britain, people were shocked and angry, and King George was furious with the colonists, right? Because tea was very precious. It was very important. It was almost like an insult and a slap in the face. Like, how dare you throw our tea into the sea? All right, so, and then that leads to the Intolerable Acts. And, you know, obviously stereotypical dress up of Native Americans. And so they took over a ship, obviously, right? And they're pulling out the chest of tea from this strong store hole and dumping them. So our vocabulary is boycott, to protest by refusing to use or buy goods or services. And then we also are going to have the First Continental Congress, which was the meeting of 12 delegates held to present complaints to King George III. And they also set up the second meeting. And we'll talk about that in the next section. All right, so then let's go to our reading. All right, the Boston Tea Party. Why did it happen? Parliament repealed all the taxes on tea except British tea, and that was the Tea Act of 1773. And then the events happened on December 16th. The men dressed as natives dumped the tea into the Boston Harbor, and it angered the King George and Britain. So then that leads us to the Intolerable Acts. Now, something that's intolerable. I remember from the beginning of the chapter, they said, imagine Great Britain is the parent and the colonists are the children, right? You do something bad, really bad, what are your parents going to do, right? They're going to ground you, they're going to punish you, they're going to take something away. So intolerable, um, it was intolerable. Like the colonists couldn't bear it. The Intolerable Acts. So after the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed several laws called the Coercive Acts. Coercive means force, right? Coerce. The British wanted to or force the colonists to obey Great Britain. Many colonists said that they could not tolerate or accept these harsh laws. The colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. One law, the Boston Port Act, closed Boston Harbor. Trade ships could not enter or leave the harbor until Boston paid for the lost tea. Many workers lost their jobs, and people feared that the citizens of Boston would starve. Other colonists helped by sending money, food, and supplies to Boston. In addition, September 1774, the First Continental Congress was held. The leaders from every colony except Georgia, and you have to remember Georgia is only about 20 so years old, and so it was a lot of the laws from Georgia were controlled by the governor. Georgia was created, and so King George can only overturn any law an assembly passed, and so Georgia was more strongly controlled by Britain, so that's why it wasn't included in the First Continental Congress. Um, and they discussed their complaints about Great Britain. The angry delegates agreed to fight against the Boston Port Act and the other intolerable acts. All right, and we'll talk about what happens at the First Continental Congress. So, they're called the Coercive Acts of 1774, but the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts because they couldn't handle dealing with them. And they wanted to try to control the colonies. They closed the harbor. So a lot of the things that were included in the Coercive Acts were meaning anyone who got arrested, they didn't have a trial. They were just British troops can handle their punishments. They took away all of the colonies' individual rights to have their assemblies or their town halls or their House of Burgesses in Virginia. So their own little colonial government, they couldn't do that. And they really just kind of put their foot down and said, you're not allowed to choose your own laws. What Parliament says goes. And so because the colonists lost all of their independence that they had gained over the past, for some, 50 plus years, it angered them. And so then we get to the First Continental Congress. Now, during a lot of this, we also start to get some tension because they also are having they're having to store or quarter the soldiers again. More taxes are being put on them. So this First Continental Congress becomes super important because it's the first or the second time, if you include the Committee of Correspondences, where the colonies begin to become unified, right? All right, so what we're going to talk about next is at the First Continental Congress, we had our delegates, and some of our delegates were Patrick Henry, George Washington, Samuel Adams, John Jay, John Dickinson, and then that was when they first met. And then later on, you got Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock. A lot of these key names are also what we call our founding fathers, and they met during this year before the Second Continental Congress. Now, Patrick Henry, if we look at our reading, Patrick Henry, oh, no. So at these committees, you start to have a lot of the colonists begin to talk out against the treatment of the colonists from Britain. And so one founding father was Patrick Henry, and he gave this speech, and his words are legendary words that kind of begin to start the spark of those who are willing to realize that they can no longer be controlled by Britain, right? And this is kind of like the end of this chapter is like, what's the key thing that makes them realize that they can no longer be controlled under Britain and they cannot handle the treatment by King George III. So Patrick Henry gives this speech at in Virginia for kind of rallying the Virginia government to realize what, and there's, when you say Mr. President, that's president of the committee group, um, or the delegate of the House of Burgesses, and address the House, yeah, the House of Burgesses. So you begin to see what they talk about in terms of their treatment and how they're being controlled by Britain. So I'm just going to read an excerpt. After the First Continental Congress, they send a letter to Britain asking for, can we change this? Can you please change this? Can you listen to our voice? And Britain ignores them. And and then they're constantly being treated poorly by the British troops. So there is a little excerpt of his speech that's reread. Colonial Williamsburg, it's like the actual colonial group that reenact colonial times. They have a lot of great information on this. So I'm just going to share one little minute sections for you. Just listen to this.
Tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have all been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the very foot of the throne. In vain, sir, after these things, may we indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, and which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir. We must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us.
So what he's saying is he's speaking to the Virginia representative group to say, the treatment that we're doing is leading us to fight. We need to fight against Britain. And this is kind of like the beginnings of the revolution, beginnings of the small colonial militias that are gathered. And then at the very end, we get our key famous words that Patrick Henry is so known for.
Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death.
So the key words here, right? Give me liberty or give me death. That becomes like the tail and the sign for this group of colonists in the colonies who are realizing they can no longer stand this treatment by the king, right? They all have their abilities to have their freedoms, and they're willing to fight for it. And this becomes the theme for our next chapter.